Culinary sovereign status complete. Kitchen liberation system closing. Designation on file. Omega. May your next life be seasoned well. The voice clicked off inside my skull like a stove burner switching to zero, and 40 years of flour, garlic, and scorched sugar went out with it. Along with, apparently, one very important detail about my new biology that the system had decided to mention exactly once, in passing, like it wasn't going to matter. It was going to matter enormously, I just didn't know that yet. What replaced the voice was worse: cheap cologne, flat champagne gone warm, a bass line thudding through the floor of a private room I did not recognize, in a body that had not been 20 seconds ago, mine. I blinked. The chandelier overhead was too bright, too gold, the kind of fixture that costs more than a restaurant's yearly lease, and does nothing for the food. My hands. Someone else's hands, slim and unmarked, no burn scar along the left thumb where I'd once branded myself with a cast-iron pan during my second year of culinary school, rested on velvet cushions in a private lounge on the top floor of a club called Orem, 2 blocks off Sunset. Noah. A voice, oily with impatience, snapped fingers an inch from my nose. Are you even listening? Mr. Whitfield's pouring you a glass. Don't be rude. I turned my head, my new head, apparently, and found a man in a slate-gray blazer leaning too close, breath sour with bourbon. Kyle Dorsey, 38, my manager at Apex Talent Group, a man whose entire professional philosophy could be summarized as whatever keeps the check coming. The name arrived the way spoiled milk arrives in your nose before your brain catches up. I was Noah Bennett, 23, 2 years into a modeling and acting career that had never quite taken off, sitting in booth 6 of a club I hadn't chosen to enter, across from a producer who had just set a tumbler of red wine an inch from my mouth like he was feeding a baby bird. Chad Whitfield, 45, a mid-tier producer better known for who he knew than what he'd ever made. He had the tan of a man who owned stock in tanning salons, and the smile of someone who'd never once faced a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of. Come on, sweetheart, Chad said. 1 drink, that's all I'm asking. You want the second lead in Coastline, don't you? I greenlight that role tonight if you're. His eyes dipped, unhurried, insulting, friendly. And then it hit me, not the wine, the memory. Noah Bennett's memory, flooding in like grease catching fire. This exact booth, this exact wine, this exact man's hand, closing over his wrist. The drugged glass, the photos taken while he was unconscious. The slow-motion demolition that followed, blacklisted within a week, dragged through every gossip site in the country, his manager selling him out for a finder's fee. And months later, his father collapsing on the kitchen floor of their apartment in Van Nuys, with a chest infection nobody caught in time, because the emergency room copay was money they didn't have. His younger brother, 17 and grieving, dropping out of school to work construction, breaking his ankle on a scaffold before the year was out. A hospital bill neither of them could pay. A studio apartment with a space heater that clicked and sparked and never once produced heat. The December everything finally, quietly, came apart at the seams. I knew all of it in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The way you know a nightmare is a nightmare only once you've already lived through the worst part of it. Not again. My fingers, Noah's fingers, which had spent 40 years of another life, learning exactly how much pressure it takes to flip a scallop without tearing the sear, reached out, unhurried, and closed around the stem of that wine glass with a calm that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with muscle memory. Somewhere in the back of Noah's borrowed mind, a much lazier, much less dignified thought surfaced right on schedule. You know, for a guy who just got reincarnated with zero warning, I'm handling this remarkably well. Somebody give me a medal, or, at minimum, a nap. Chad's grin widened, mistaking stillness for surrender. He leaned in. I turned the glass upside down over the crown of his head. The wine came down in one clean, sluicing rope. This is a skill, by the way, pouring liquid with intention. You learn it draining bechamel through cheesecloth 11,000 times in a past life you never asked for, and painted a dark red seam straight down Chad Whitfield's overpriced haircut over his forehead into the collar of his $800 shirt. The room went dead silent, except for the bass thumping through the wall, oblivious. You, Chad shot up, sputtering, wine dripping off his chin, like he'd been baptized in something he very much did not deserve. You insane little. Noah, what is wrong with you? Kyle grabbed a fistful of cocktail napkins, dabbing frantically at Chad's ruined shirt like that would fix anything at all. Get down and apologize. Right now. I stood instead, straightened my cuff, and looked at both of them with the flat, unbothered calm of a man who had once talked down a Michelin inspector mid-service without breaking his stride. If anyone's apologizing, I said, it's going to be on their knees, and it isn't going to be me. You walk out that door, Chad snarled. You're done, done. I will make sure you never work in this town again. 200,000 in breach of contract damages, Kyle added, voice climbing into a register I imagine only dogs could properly hear. You think you can just walk away from Apex? You think? I have a recording of this entire conversation. I let that land, watching Chad's spray tan go 2 shades paler. I turned on the voice memo app in my jacket pocket the second Kyle told me who I was meeting tonight and why. Call it instinct. I'd start thinking less about damages, Mr. Whitfield, and more about lawyers. The color that finished draining out of Chad's face was, frankly, one of the more satisfying things I had witnessed in either of my lives. You're bluffing, he said, though his voice cracked clean in half on the second word. I didn't answer. I picked my jacket up off the booth, gave them both the exact smile you'd give a soufflé that was about to spectacularly collapse, and walked out, leaving cologne and base and the wreckage of somebody's ruined night behind me. Kyle's threats chased me down the hallway. I didn't look back. Outside, the November air off sunset was cold enough to fog my breath, and somewhere down the block a taco cart was still going, steam curling off the griddle into streetlight. I stood there a moment, breathing, alive, here. My father's heart still beating somewhere across the city, my brother still 17, still whole, still bent over his homework under a lamp nobody had shut off for non-payment. I looked down at my hands, unscarred, untrained, but mine now, mine to build something with. The entertainment industry could keep its velvet booths and its imaginary lawsuits. I wanted to go home and cook. If you're new here, hi, I'm the guy narrating a man's second chance at life, through the lens of a food cart and a criminal empire he doesn't know about yet. Hit subscribe if you want to be here for the whole ride, because it gets a lot more interesting from here. Okay, back to the wine stains. By 6 the next morning, my phone had 31 missed calls, most of them Kyle, and a headline from a gossip site with more monthly readers than the population of Delaware. Blacklisted. Rising star Noah Bennett assaults producer at private club. Sources say diva behavior behind sudden meltdown. There was a photo attached. I looked, in it, appropriately deranged, mouth open mid-sentence, wineglass mid-pour, captured at the single least flattering angle a photographer could physically have found in that room. Truly a professional accomplishment, if you think about it. I decided not to think about it. I made coffee, sat on the kitchen counter of my Koreatown studio, and read the article with the detached interest of a chef, reading a bad review he already knows is wrong, and mostly just wants to see how creative the insults get. My phone rang. Kyle, I answered on speaker, slicing an apple while I did, because a man has priorities in mine, apparently, now included snacking through my own character assassination. Noah, are you sober yet? Whitfield pulled his financing from Coastline. You're going to owe. My contract, I said, taking a bite, specifies my obligations as artistic engagements. It does not specify drinking with investors or being friendly, as Mr. Whitfield so charmingly phrased it. I still have the recording. Should I forward it to Apex's legal team, or would you prefer a lawyer handle the introduction? Silence, then quieter, uglier. You set me up. I defended myself, I said, unbothered. Send the termination paperwork. Don't call again. I blocked his number before he could summon a second decibel, then stared at my bank balance for a while. The way you stare at an oven timer that's clearly broken, but you keep checking it anyway. 2 years of near misses in this industry had left me with $890 and an apron I'd bought on a whim months ago and never once used. Not much, but it was mine, and it was enough to start over, assuming I didn't do anything catastrophically expensive, like, say, buy a food cart I couldn't actually afford. I made a mental note to budget like an adult this time. The system had apparently given me 40 years of culinary mastery and exactly 0 financial common sense. Rude. I packed a duffel bag, took the bus to the valley, and got off 2 stops early to walk the rest, partly to save the fare, mostly because I wanted to see the neighborhood with new eyes. Van Nuys hadn't changed. Same chain link fences, same jacaranda trees dropping purple confetti on cracked sidewalks. I stopped at the gate of a small stucco house with a dead lawn and a wind chime made of bottle caps, and something in my chest cracked wide open. In the driveway, a man in his 50s knelt beside an ancient lawnmower, gray hair sticking up in tufts, grease streaked across a faded flannel shirt. "Dad," I said, voice rougher than I meant it to be. Robert Bennett, 54, a maintenance supervisor with a bad knee and a good heart, looked up, and for 1 second his face did nothing, and then it did everything at once, breaking into the kind of smile that made every reckless decision I'd ever considered feel worth avoiding. "Noah, what are you doing home, kid?" He didn't finish, because I'd already crossed the yard and wrapped both arms around him, grease stains and all. "Whoa, hey," he laughed, patting my back, bewildered. "You all right? You look like you saw a ghost." "I saw my own funeral. In another life, I'm not letting it happen again." "I'm good, Dad," I said instead. "Just missed you." The screen door banged. A lanky teenager in a faded band t-shirt bounded down the porch steps 2 at a time, math textbook still open in one hand. Caleb Bennett, 17, my little brother, allergic to homework and extremely online, nearly tackled me. "Noah, you're actually here? Dad's been talking about you nonstop. It's honestly embarrassing." "Missed you too, punk," he said, ruffling his hair, throat tight. Over dinner, a dinner I insisted on cooking myself, much to my father's bemused protest. I told them everything that mattered without the parts they'd never believe, that I was done with the industry, that I wanted to cook, that I needed exactly one thing, which was permission to try. My father set down his fork after the first bite of braised pork and eggs, looked at it, looked at me, and said very seriously, "Son, when did you learn to cook like this?" "Long story," I said. "Longer than you'd believe. Short version. I got very good very fast, and I intend to be extremely lazy about everything else in my life to compensate." He studied me a moment, the way fathers do when they sense something shifted in their kid but can't name it, then just nodded. "That industry never deserved you anyway. Cook. Long as you're happy, and long as we don't starve." "We won't starve," I promised, already doing math about propane tanks and permit fees in my head. "Trust me, I know exactly what I'm doing." I did not, in fact, know exactly what I was doing, but I knew how to braise a short rib until it fell off the bone, and in my experience, that solves roughly 70% of life's problems. It took 2 days to gut and sand a second-hand 3-wheeled cart I bought off a retiring taco vendor in Pacoima for $600, most of what I had left, and, if my father is to be believed, a personal record display of financial impulsiveness even for a Bennett. I repainted the frame a weathered sage green, bolted a stainless prep table across the top, and hand-lettered a small wooden sign, "Bennett's Lunchbox." The kitchen was borrowed, my father's garage, scrubbed and reorganized into something resembling a functional prep space, a mini fridge from a yard sale, a used 2-burner propane stove. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't need to be. 40 years of a past life taught me the food does the talking. The room just needs to be clean, and the cook needs, ideally, more than 4 hours of sleep, though I was clearly not going to get that particular luxury for a while. Opening morning, I was up at 4:30, a time of day I would like it noted, for the record, that I resent on a spiritual level, elbow deep in pork belly at the wholesale market before sunrise, picking through cuts with the kind of scrutiny that made the vendor raise an eyebrow. "You buying for a restaurant, kid?" "Something like that," I said, and paid for pork belly, quail eggs, bok choy, and a bag of daikon that still had dirt on the roots. By 10:30, the cart rolled, quite literally, hitched to a trailer on my father's pickup, into a gravel lot behind Golden Coast Studios, the sprawling backlot off Ventura Boulevard, where 3 productions were shooting that week. Not the front gate with its security booth and autograph seekers. The backlot, grip trucks, background actors smoking between takes, crew eating whatever catering happened to show up. I set up under an old sycamore, popped the lid on the hot box, and let the smell do the marketing I was too tired and too broke to pay for. Braised pork belly, red-cooked the old way. Sugar caramelized slow until it went the deep amber of good soy and star anise, coaxed along with ginger and orange juice standing in for rice wine I didn't have on hand. Quail eggs fried until the skin crisped enough to drink up sauce. Garlicky bok choy, blistered fast and hot. A side of daikon and pork bone soup, clear as glass. 12 minutes after I lifted the lid, a lighting tech in a sweat-stained shirt, stopped dead in his tracks and sniffed the air like a cartoon character following a pie on a windowsill. He bought one lunchbox. Then, 4 minutes later, came back for 3 more, looking personally betrayed that he hadn't discovered this sooner. By noon, there was a line. By day 3, there was a line and a black SUV parked at an angle across 2 spots, like whoever drove it had never once needed to consider whether he was parking correctly. I noticed him the moment he got out, tall, 6'2" at minimum, dressed with the kind of understated, expensive precision that made every crew member's Carhartt jacket look like a costume by comparison. Dark hair cut close at the sides, a jaw you could genuinely cut glass on, sunglasses despite the overcast sky, like he wanted to watch people without being watched back. He didn't join the line. He stood apart from it, hands in his pockets, studying the cart, studying me, with the flat, assessing patience of a man used to getting whatever he wanted the instant he wanted it. I clocked him and kept working. Whoever he was, his money wasn't any better than anyone else's in this line, and Bennett's lunchbox didn't do skip-the-line privileges. Not for producers, not for anyone, and especially not for a man who parked like the DMV had personally wronged him. When the line thinned, he approached, sliding his sunglasses up into his hair. His eyes were a deep, unsettled brown, faintly shadowed, the kind of shadow that comes from too many sleepless nights and too much responsibility. "1 box," he said, low voice a little rough at the edges like gravel under velvet, "whatever's today's." "Pork belly," I said, sliding the lid off. "Comes with rice, blistered green beans, daikon soup. Fair warning, it's rich. If you haven't eaten much lately, pace yourself." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, at being read that precisely by a stranger. "What makes you say that?" "Occupational hazard," I said, packing the box. "I feed people for a living. You learn to look at a face and guess what it's been skipping. Also, no offense, but you look like a man whose stomach filed a complaint with HR." That got the barest twitch at the corner of his mouth, gone almost before I registered it, but I registered it. I am, if nothing else, an extremely attentive man when the payoff is watching someone gorgeous almost smile. $12, I said. He handed over 100 without blinking. "I don't do charity tips," I said, already counting change. "You paid for a lunchbox, not my dignity. Also, respectfully, learn to carry smaller bills. This is a food cart, not a hedge fund." That finally got an actual reaction, the corner of his mouth losing its fight entirely. "Noted," he said, and took his change without argument, which I respected, and walked off toward the sycamore, sitting alone at a picnic table like he'd never once in his life sat down casually anywhere. I watched, against my own better judgment, as he opened the box, picked up the plastic fork like it might bite him, and took the first bite. His shoulders, braced, I hadn't noticed how braced until they dropped, sank by a visible inch. He closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, and then he ate the entire box methodically, in a silence that read less like enjoyment and more like a man rediscovering, mid-meal, that he was allowed to want things. Interesting, I thought, filing the observation away with the detached professional curiosity of a chef, and the significantly less detached personal curiosity of a man who had just noticed how good that jaw looked doing something as simple as chewing. He came back the next day and the day after. By day 9, I knew his order before he opened his mouth, and he'd started arriving a full hour early, leaning against the SUV, watching me prep with an attention that had stopped pretending to be casual. "You're early again," I told him, not looking up from the ginger I was mincing. "You're interesting to watch," he said, with the bluntness of a man who had never once needed to soften a sentence for anyone's comfort. "Most people rush. You don't." "Rushing ruins a braise," I said. "You want it done right. You go at the pace the food asks for, not the pace you'd prefer. Revolutionary concept, I know. I'm considering writing a self-help book. Slow down, you absolute menace. A cookbook." "Huh," he said, like I'd told him something more important than a cooking tip. "I'm Dante, by the way, since I've eaten your food 11 times and you still don't know my name." Dante Marchetti, 32. Even the sound of it landed heavy, deliberate. A name built for a man with power to spare, and evidently absolutely no idea how to use small talk. "Noah," I said, though something in the way he said it told me he already knew. "I know," he said, confirmed. "Then why'd you ask my name back?" "I wanted to hear you say it," he said. Entirely unbothered by how much that sentence should have embarrassed him, and walked off before I could formulate a response, leaving me standing there with a knife in one hand and my composure somewhere on the floor of the food cart, mildly ruined. It took me a full 2 weeks to notice the thing my body kept doing every time Dante got within 10 feet of me, a low, involuntary thrum under my skin, warm and unfamiliar, like a kettle just short of whistling. I finally looked it up on my phone during a lull between the lunch rush and cleanup, sitting on an overturned crate behind the cart, and felt several genuinely inconvenient facts click into place at once. Omega, secondary gender designation, present in roughly 1 in every 8 people, characterized by scent-based biological responses to alpha pheromones, typically suppressed from adolescence onward with over-the-counter patches, which explained the little box of patches I'd found, unopened, in Noah Bennett's bathroom cabinet the first week, and had assumed, with the confidence of a man who does not read instructions, were some kind of skincare product. I'd been going without suppressants for 2 weeks, directly downwind of an extremely large, extremely intense alpha. Well, I thought, staring at my phone with the weary resignation of a man discovering a structural flaw in a house he'd already moved into. That explains a few things. Dante, for his part, had apparently noticed something was different too. Alphas being famously bad at subtlety about it. He showed up that afternoon a little later than usual, a little stiffer in the shoulders, and stood a careful, deliberate 3 feet farther back than his normal spot at the counter. "You smell different today," he said, like it physically pained him to admit he'd noticed. "Cleaner, sharper." I apologize if that's an invasive thing to say." "It's fine," I said, deciding bluntness was the only sane option here. "I'm an Omega. I've been off suppressants because I genuinely did not realize I owned them until 3 days ago, which, in my defense, is a very normal thing to not realize about your own life." Something shifted in his expression. A careful, controlled kind of want immediately reined back in. "You don't have to tell me that." "You'd have figured it out eventually," I said. "You keep hovering like a man standing too close to a bakery window. I'm choosing radical honesty over you, slowly losing your mind out of politeness." He laughed, that same startled, unguarded bark of a sound I was beginning to actively collect, and some of the tension left his shoulders. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've got excellent control. I'm not going to do anything you don't want." "I know," I said, and meant it. There was something in the deliberate, careful way he held himself around me that read less like restraint under strain and more like a man being gentle on purpose, which, if you want to know the exact moment I started actually falling for Dante Marchetti instead of just enjoying the view, that was probably it. "Good," he said, quiet, "because I'd very much like to keep coming back here." "You could just say you like the food," I said, deadpan, going back to my prep station before my ears could betray how warm they'd gone. "I like the food," he said. "I also like you. Both statements are true. I contain multitudes." "You contain a very expensive SUV and questionable parking habits," I said, and had the singular pleasure of watching Dante Marchetti, a man I would later learn made grown businessmen sweat through their suits with a single glance, go faintly, helplessly pink at the tips of his ears. The story of Bennett's Lunchbox spread through Golden Coast Studios the way good gossip always does, faster than any press release. Within 3 weeks, I'd gone from 50 boxes a day to 200. By the end of the month, 500 boxes, sold out every single time inside 15 minutes flat. I never repeated a menu twice in a week, mostly because repetition bores me, and partly because a man needs some creative outlet after being reincarnated with an internal clock that insists on 4:30 a.m. wake-ups against every wish of his soul. Monday might be sweet and sour ribs, glazed until they lacquered like stained glass. Tuesday, mapo tofu, silky and trembling, its heat built in careful layers. Wednesday, orange chicken done honestly, hand-battered, bright with real citrus. By Friday, the line stretched from the sycamore clear around the prop truck. Dante began arriving with 2 folding chairs in the back of the Suburban, setting them up without asking, and I began, without quite deciding to, making him a second dish that wasn't on the day's menu, something lighter, meant for a stomach that had clearly spent months rejecting rich food out of stress. Congee with shredded chicken and ginger. Clear broth with wontons thin enough to read through. Noodles in a light vinegar chili dressing that he ate with a startled, boyish enthusiasm that had nothing in common with the controlled stillness he wore everywhere else. "You're spoiling me," he said one afternoon, watching me shave ginger into curls for his broth. "I told you, I feed people for a living," I said. "It's not spoiling, it's competence. There's a difference, though I'll admit the line gets blurry when it comes to you specifically." "Who are you performing for, Noah Bennett?" he asked, low, watching me with an intensity I still hadn't gotten used to. "Nobody," I said, and realized with a small jolt that it was true for the first time in either of my lives. That's kind of the whole point. Also, I'm too lazy to perform. Performing is exhausting. Cooking well and being funny about it is much less effort. He reached out then, slow, deliberate, giving me every chance to pull away, and brushed a smear of flour off my cheekbone with his thumb. His hand was warm, calloused in places that didn't match a man who supposedly ran a real estate empire from behind a desk. "Good," he said. "Stay that way." I didn't move, didn't want to. The sycamore leaves rustled overhead, dropping dappled light across both of us, and for exactly 4 seconds neither of us breathed like people with anywhere else to be. Then a crew member yelled something about the AD needing lunch orders, and the moment folded itself neatly away, tucked into a growing pile I wasn't ready to name yet, but was, admittedly, keeping a very careful mental inventory of. By July, Dante had a standing chair under the sycamore, and a standing joke about how he was, in his words, load-bearing furniture at this point. My father had taken to calling him the SUV guy, with the same fond exasperation he'd once reserved for my terrible childhood report cards. "He's here again," my father said one Saturday, watching the black Suburban pull in from the garage window. "That's, 6 days a week now." "He has a very demanding relationship with lunch," I said, not looking up from the prep table. "Uh-huh," my father said, in the tone of a man who has clocked exactly what's going on, and is choosing generously not to embarrass his son about it directly. That August, Dante took a rare afternoon off, the first I'd seen, and instead of hovering at the cart, showed up at the house with 2 tickets to a Dodgers game he'd bought, he admitted, entirely because he'd overheard me complain about never having time to watch one anymore. "You hate crowds," I pointed out, climbing into the passenger seat of the Suburban, deeply suspicious of this level of effort from a man I was still 90% sure ran his empire by intimidating spreadsheets into submission. "I hate crowds that aren't yelling about baseball," he said. "Turns out I can tolerate almost anything if you're next to me being insufferable about hot dog toppings." "Ketchup is a valid hot dog topping, and I will not be lectured," I said. "It's a war crime," he said, perfectly serious, and I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my soda, and somewhere between the 4th inning and the 7th inning stretch, his hand found mine on the armrest and just stayed there, warm and certain, while 11,000 strangers around us sang off-key about peanuts and Cracker Jack. I didn't pull away. I didn't want to. For the record, I am an extremely lazy romantic, and holding hands requires significantly less effort than overthinking whether I should. Kyle Dorsey did not take my success well. Ricky Stanton, 30, a freelance paparazzo with a lens too long for his own good, and a moral compass that had been sold for parts years ago, had been circling my life for 2 weeks by then, tipped off, I'd later learn, by Kyle himself, who'd noticed the black Suburban's suspicious regularity and smelled a story worth selling. The first attempt was clumsy, a smear piece on a gossip site called Pulse, built around unflattering photos, captioned to make my cart look like a rusted health code violation, and me look like a washed-up has-been peddling questionable meat off a stolen shopping cart. Caleb showed me the article at dinner, jaw tight with the specific fury only a little brother can summon. "Should we shut down for a few days? Let it blow over?" "No," I said, spooning rice onto his plate before my own, an old habit that had followed me into this life. "We keep the food honest and let the internet embarrass itself. It's very good at that without our help." It might have stayed a small, ugly ripple that faded on its own, if Sienna Cross hadn't decided, entirely on her own initiative, to make it a much bigger problem for everyone involved. Sienna Cross, 29, reigning 2-time Best Actress winner, 60 million followers, famously private, famously allergic to fan interaction of any kind, posted a selfie that night. No makeup, hair in a scrunchie, holding an empty Bennett's lunchbox container, scraped clean enough to see her reflection in the cardboard. Unsanitary my entire ass. Got up at 5 a.m. and stood in line for 2 hours for this man's short ribs, and I would do it again tomorrow. Some of y'all have never had a proper meal, and it truly shows. Frank Callahan, 61, a veteran director legendary for reducing Oscar winners to tears over blocking notes, followed with a video of himself scraping the last grains of rice out of a container with a fork. Kid, if there's no rib box on set tomorrow, we're shutting down production. I mean it. By morning, the smear piece was buried under an avalanche of ridicule, and Pulse had quietly deleted the article, though not before the internet, in its endless capacity for petty archaeology, immortalized it in screenshots forever. The second attempt was the one that mattered. Dante had shown up one evening, straight from a business dinner he clearly hadn't enjoyed, jaw tight, tie loosened, looking like a man who needed something he couldn't name. I pulled him into the garage kitchen without a word and started a pot of soup while he decompressed in a silence we'd fallen into without ever discussing it. "Rough night?" I asked, slicing scallions. "Investors," he said, like the word tasted bad. "Everyone in that room wanted a piece of something. Nobody actually saw me, present company excluded." I glanced over. There was something exposed in his face that night, and it made my chest ache in a way I'd stopped trying to talk myself out of. "Come here," I said, and when he did, folding that dangerous, powerful frame down onto the stool beside me, close enough his knee brushed mine, I reached up and smoothed a line of tension from between his eyebrows with my thumb. He went still, then turned his head and pressed a kiss into my palm, soft, reverent, nothing like the confidence he wore everywhere else. "Noah," he said rough, "I think about you more than I think about anything else, and I don't hate it. I should probably hate it. It makes me predictable." "Being soft with the right person isn't weakness," I said. "It's home, if you want it to be." That was the exact moment Ricky Stanton's shutter went off through the fence gap. 3 shots. Dante's face tilted toward my palm, unguarded in a way no camera had ever caught in 32 years, my hand cradling his jaw, the two of us close enough that anyone looking would know instantly, unmistakably, what they were seeing. The headline hit at 6 the next morning on an outlet with real reach. Marchetti Empire Hears Secret, Real Estate Mogul's Late-Night Visits to Blacklisted Ex-Idol's Family Kitchen. I braced for a repeat of the original Noah Bennett's entire ruined life, dragged back into the light with a bigger target attached this time. It never came, though it took 2 very different kinds of intervention to make sure of it. The public one came first. Dante didn't call lawyers or issue a denial. 10 hours after the story broke, he posted a video to an account that had never, in its entire history, contained a single personal photo, him at my father's kitchen table, laughing, actually unself-consciously laughing, at something off-camera. For anyone still asking, yes, it's exactly what it looks like. I didn't know what a home-cooked meal tasted like until Noah Bennett fed me one. I'm not interested in denying something I'm proud of. The internet imploded in the other direction. Sienna reposted it with 3 hearts. Frank commented, "Finally, a rich guy with taste." The private one, nobody saw, and I only heard about it secondhand, weeks later, from Caleb, who'd overheard my father on the phone with a lawyer friend. Dante didn't sue Ricky Stanton. He didn't sue Kyle. He simply had Miles Turner, his longtime assistant and fixer, 34, terrifyingly efficient, allergic to raising his voice because he's never once needed to, arrange a quiet meeting between Dante and Kyle Dorsey at a coffee shop in Burbank. No cameras, no witnesses beyond Miles standing by the door with his arms crossed. Whatever was said in that 15-minute conversation, Kyle Dorsey emerged from it looking, according to the barista, who later sold the story to absolutely no one, because Miles had already handled that too, like a man who'd just watched his entire future get quietly repossessed. Kyle didn't get arrested. He didn't need to be. Apex Talent fired him within the week once the recording of the original Wineglass incident finally surfaced in full context, and every industry contact he had evaporated overnight. Not through threats, Dante told me later, just through the simple, devastating fact that nobody wanted to be caught doing business with a man Dante Marchetti had personally sat down across a table from, and quietly, calmly made an example of. The last anyone heard of Kyle, he was working a drive-through window 2 towns over, recognized and filmed by 9 separate customers, the video racking up 4 million views under the caption, "Justice tastes better than a 10-piece combo." Chad Whitfield fared no better. Dropped from 3 productions once the full recording surfaced, his last public appearance was a red carpet where he slipped on ice near the Step and Repeat, and landed directly in a catering table's chocolate fountain, footage looping on entertainment shows for a solid week. I did not orchestrate this. I would like it on the record that the universe simply has excellent comedic timing. I want to take a moment here, if you don't mind, to talk about a Tuesday that had absolutely nothing dramatic happen in it, because I think those mattered just as much as the scandals, and nobody ever puts them in the highlight reel. It was raining, genuinely rare for the valley, and the cart couldn't run, so Dante and I spent the whole afternoon in the garage kitchen with nowhere to be. I taught him to fold dumplings. He was, and I say this with love, catastrophically bad at it, producing a tray of what I generously called abstract art, instead of anything resembling a crescent shape. "This one looks like it's had a difficult week," I said, holding up his worst attempt. "That one's my favorite," he said, deeply unbothered. "I named him Gary. He's been through a lot." "You cannot name a dumpling Gary." Gary would disagree if he could speak, which he can't, because he's a dumpling which I made, badly, on purpose, to make you laugh. That's the least efficient plan I've ever heard. "I run a criminal empire and a real estate conglomerate simultaneously," he said. "Efficiency isn't the only skill I've got." We ate the entire tray, Gary included, sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor because every chair somehow felt too far apart, rain drumming on the garage roof, and it was, without a single scandal or headline anywhere near it, one of the best afternoons of either of my lives. We opened an actual storefront that fall, a converted 2-story building near Silver Lake, close enough to the studios that our old crowd could still find us, cozy enough it felt like an extension of my father's kitchen rather than a betrayal of it. My father ran the register with the contentment of a man who'd stopped worrying about bills that in this life never came. Caleb, now a college freshman, determined to one day run the empire, as he insisted on calling a mid-size restaurant, worked weekends with a tray balanced on one hand. Winter came with string lights, and a holiday menu I refused to compromise on, no matter how many people begged for a peppermint anything. "It's a lunchbox restaurant, not a candy cane," I told a very persistent customer. "Have some standards." Dante spent Christmas Eve with us, learning, slowly, stubbornly, with the same relentless focus that had built an empire, how to fillet a fish, how to tell when rice was properly steamed by smell alone. He was still bad at dumplings. He had, against all odds, gotten worse. "You've gotten good at this," I told him, watching him carve a radish into something that vaguely resembled a flower. "I had a good teacher," he said, not looking up. "Also, I may have requested more private lessons than were strictly necessary. I noticed you've asked for extra credit 4 times this month." "In my defense," he said, setting down the knife, reaching for me instead, "the extra credit is my favorite part of the curriculum." He kissed me, unhurried, warm, tasting faintly of ginger tea, and I let myself sink into it the way you sink into a good broth after a long day. No rush, no performance, just the quiet, certain warmth of belonging exactly where I was. "Move in with me," he said against my mouth. Weeks later, both of us tangled on the porch swing outside my father's house, fried rice going cold between us because neither of us had wanted to stop kissing long enough to eat it. "I know it's fast. I don't care. I've spent my whole life running something nobody sees the real version of, and you're the only person who's ever looked at me and seen the actual man instead of the name. I don't want to go one more night without you in the next room." I looked at this man, who once terrified boardrooms with a glance, currently pink-eared and nervous over a porch swing confession, and felt the last of Noah Bennett's old grief, the version of this life that ended in a cold apartment with a broken heater, finally, completely dissolve. "Yes," I said. "Obviously yes. Though fair warning, I'm bringing all my knives, and I expect a kitchen with real counter space, not whatever real estate mogul minimalist nonsense you've currently got going on." "I would expect nothing less," he said, laughing into the next kiss, the sycamore outside rustling like applause. 2 weeks after I moved in, I learned something else about the whole Alpha Omega thing nobody had bothered to mention in any of the pamphlets. Bonding isn't just a ceremony you schedule. It's a choice an alpha makes about restraint every single day, right up until the moment both people decide together they don't want the restraint anymore. I found this out because Dante, for 2 solid weeks, had been sleeping in the guest room of his own house. "You do realize this is ridiculous," I told him on night 14, standing in his doorway in one of his own oversized shirts, arms crossed. I live here now. You could just, share a bed with your own boyfriend like a normal person. I don't trust myself yet, he admitted, low, sitting on the edge of the guest bed like a man confessing to a crime. Alphas get protective around this stage. Possessive. I don't want to push something on you before you're ready to be pushed. Dante. I crossed the room, sat down beside him, took his hand. I've been in Omega for approximately 4 months, and I already know exactly what I want. I want you, all of it, whenever you're ready to stop being noble about it. He looked at me like I'd handed him something he'd stopped believing existed. When I bond with you, he said, quiet, serious, in a way I'd rarely heard him, it's not casual, it's not something an alpha undoes. I need you to know that going in. I've had 2 lives, I said. I know what permanent feels like. This is the first thing in either of them I've been completely certain about. That was the night the guest room stopped getting used. We bonded the following spring in the courtyard of the Silver Lake restaurant, under strings of warm cafe lights and an actual sycamore, sapling my father insisted on planting for the occasion. So the tree that started it all has a family too, he said, uncharacteristically sentimental, and none of us had the heart to tease him for it. Sienna officiated, having gotten herself ordained online specifically for the occasion, and taking the responsibility with theatrical, hilarious gravity. Frank gave a toast that somehow turned into 45 minutes of unsolicited notes on our chemistry, before Caleb gently confiscated the microphone. Dante wore a suit the exact color of good soy reduction, which I told him was either the most romantic or the strangest compliment I'd ever paid anyone, and he said, without missing a beat, that from me it was clearly the former. When it came time for vows, Dante, a man who ran an empire through fear and precision, went visibly, helplessly emotional, voice catching twice before he finished. I used to think I understood power, he said, holding both my hands. Then I met a man selling lunchboxes out of a cart under a sycamore tree, who fed me exactly what I needed before I knew how to ask for it, and I realized I'd had it backwards the whole time. The realest power isn't the kind that makes people afraid. It's the kind that makes them feel home. You've been giving me that since day one. I intend to spend the rest of my life earning it. I don't remember my own vows word for word. Something about Brazes and patience, and the exact, unteachable difference between cooking at someone and cooking for them. But I remember the way he looked at me while I said them, like I was the only stable thing in a world he'd spent his whole life bracing against. The bond mark came last, private. Just the 2 of us stepped back into the kitchen doorway while the party carried on outside. His mouth at the curve of my neck, gentle, deliberate, a warmth that settled into my bones like the first good broth of the morning and never entirely left. I felt it land somewhere far deeper than skin, a thread pulled taut and permanent between us, the exact opposite of every unstable temporary thing either of us had built a life bracing against. We danced under the string lights until midnight, my father cutting in twice to spin me around the courtyard, the way he used to when I was small, Caleb documenting the entire evening with the enthusiasm of a man building a highlight reel for future blackmail purposes. It was, in every sense that mattered, exactly the ending Noah Bennett, both versions of him, had never quite dared to hope for. Epilogue, 6 months later. The restaurant smells like ginger and caramelized sugar every morning by 7, and I've never once gotten tired of it, though I will die on the hill that 7 a.m. is a personal attack. I found Dante in the kitchen before opening, sleeves rolled up, carefully arranging quail eggs around a mound of rice the way I'd taught him months ago. He still wasn't perfect at it. He'd never needed to be. I loved watching him try anyway, loved the particular, private pride on his face every time a dish came together under his hands. "You're humming," I said, leaning in the doorway with my coffee. "Am I?" He didn't look up, focused on the eggs. "Didn't notice?" "You do it every morning now. You used to be terrifying, you know. Grown men used to sweat when you walked into a room." "I still am terrifying," he said, mock offended. "Ask anyone at Marchetti Holdings. I've seen you name a dumpling Gary and get emotional about him." "That stays between us," he said, crossing the kitchen in 3 unhurried steps, wrapping both arms around me from behind, pressing a kiss to the curve of my neck right over the mark that was permanently, unmistakably his. "You're the only one who gets to know that. Deal?" "Deal," I said, tilting my head back against his shoulder, watching morning light slant gold through the front windows, catching on the little sycamore sapling my father had transplanted into a barrel pot by the door, already putting out new leaves. Outside, I could hear my father unlocking the front door, humming off-key to the radio. Caleb's car crunched into the alley, tires loud, running 15 minutes late as usual. A Bennett family tradition I refused to let die. Somewhere down the street, someone was already asking a passerby if this was the place with the short ribs everyone talked about. I thought, not for the first time, about the version of this life I never had to live, the cold apartment, the broken heater, the grief that never got the chance to happen this time around, and let it go, the way you let go of a bad batch of stock. No use crying over what never made it into the pot. What I had instead, a father who woke up healthy every single morning, a brother building a future he'd chosen instead of one grief had forced on him, a man who ran an empire through fear on the outside and asked, every night without fail, what I wanted for dinner on the inside, like my answer was the most important decision on his entire calendar. "What are you thinking about?" Dante asked, chin resting on my shoulder. "Dinner," I said, honestly. "I'm thinking about what to make you for dinner. Also how lazy I intend to be about the actual cooking today, because I have earned a slow Tuesday and you are going to help, badly, the way you always do." He laughed, that same startled, unguarded sound I'd fallen for under a sycamore tree over a year ago, and turned me around in his arms to kiss me properly, slow and certain, while the rice cooker clicked on behind us and the whole day waited, warm and unhurried, for us to finally begin it. The end.